Okay, so welcome to this session, which is really about preaching on hurt. And also it's about top tips for doing a Who Cares Sunday service. So as we seek to love and support hurting people in our communities, we can humbly admit that we do not have all the answers and that we're not really experts, are we, at a lot of the things that people were going to write on their cards. However, there are two unique things that the church has to offer: a loving church community, and let me say, there is nothing quite like a loving church community when it's working properly. And I'm sure we've all got stories of people who've experienced love in the church that has really taken their breath away. Secondly, we can address people's deepest need through preaching. And so really my seminar today has got three parts. I'm going to talk about the importance of preaching. I'm going to touch just on what is the gospel. And then my last section really is on top tips for promoting and running a Who Cares Sunday. And that will be the main meat of the session. So firstly, and fairly briefly, why is preaching so important? Well, it's because humanity's deepest need is to be reconciled to God, and preaching is God's ordained way of that primary need being addressed. And throughout the New Testament, we see that preaching was the primary activity of Jesus, his disciples, and later the church itself. So there's actually a huge amount of evidence in the New Testament that preaching and teaching is not just important, but of primary importance. It was primary in the life of Jesus. Jesus said in Luke 4, verse 18, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach." And in verse 43 of that chapter, he says, "I must proclaim the good news. That is why I was sent." Preaching was the key result of Pentecost. In Luke 2, verse 14, they were filled with the Holy Spirit. And what did they do? They preached. It was what the disciples continued to prioritize, even over other needs and concerns. In Acts 6, verse 4, they delegate other jobs so that they can prioritize the preaching of the word and prayer. Now, every now and again, there are moves in the church to de-emphasize preaching and replace it with discussion, drama, or debate, with the hope that that will be more attractive and grow the church. And that move is nothing new, but it never grows the church, as history amply demonstrates. Throughout church history, all revivals have been heralded by renewed preaching, whether that's Wesley, Calvin, Whitefield, or Edwards. And I guess this makes sense because God is not a concept ultimately to be debated or discussed. He is to be approached with reverence and fear. We need to hear his voice. So preaching is so important. Number one. Number two, let's just talk about what actually is the gospel. You know, we've already talked about sharing the good news of the gospel and how that involves more than just rehearsing one simple explanation. I guess a very important point is that the gospel is basically all about Jesus. In fact, the gospel a number of times in the New Testament is actually called the gospel of Christ. So I'm just going to send you all the Bible references where that phrase is used. The gospel of Christ is all about Jesus. And that means that when we get people to think about who is Jesus and what has Jesus done, those are the ultimate questions in all evangelism. We're not, sometimes in a conversation with someone, you can get taken down a bit of a dead end, science and Christianity. Does God exist? Those are good questions, but they're not really gospel questions because they're not centered on who is Jesus and what has he done. And actually, we don't need to start by answering the question, does God exist? Because if we can show people who Jesus is, that Jesus is God, then God exists. And that's actually the approach of Alpha. It never does a session on does God exist, but it answers the question, who is Jesus?
Areas of our church life.
So, I can hear something else.
And so for us, this was community group.
Okay.
Sorry, Rob, that was me.
Okay. Sharing the gospel is then all about explaining how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the return of Jesus connects with the lives of the people that we're speaking to. So it's really thinking, why is it good news that Christ has come, that Christ has died in our place, that Christ has risen, and that Christ will come again? And the wonderful thing about the gospel is that it does two things, in that it both humbles us and elevates us. It elevates us because it tells us that we're not mere animals. We're created in the image of God. We're incredibly precious to God. God pursues us in love. But it also humbles us because the gospel tells us that we've rebelled from God and that in 1,000 different ways we've replaced him, ignored him, disobeyed him, and rejected him. And so it's this glorious mixture. The gospel disturbs the comfortable and comforts the disturbed. It humbles, it elevates at the same time. And so we want to introduce people to Jesus Christ and make the connection between their hurt and his life, death, resurrection, and second coming. But we also want to introduce the response to Jesus, the call to follow, believe, repent, lay down our lives, and call on his name. So that's just a little section I just wanted to say about what is the gospel. And then really, I want to just give you some top tips now. Okay, so firstly, I want to talk about choosing your preaching series. So you will have all these responses. In Attleborough, we had 400 the first time, 2,000 the second time. Now we're doing Who Cares on ongoing basis. And all the time we're getting these batches of responses. So you're going to have all these responses and you've got to choose what you're going to speak on. Now, we've seen a sermon series work well in two ways. So we've done a varied series looking at the big issues, negative emotions, money worries, family, relationships, and death. And the Who Cares book basically gives you the 6 gospel presentations that we did on those 6 issues. And that could easily be the approach that you take. You could also do a series on one theme. So we did one called Who Cares About Relationships? Because we realized that so many of the answers were really to do with relationships. And we did an individual weeks on marriage, on parenting, on neighbors, on colleagues, on children, on singleness. But you could also slice them in other ways too. We would say don't be too specific about a very personal issue. So we did a Sunday on Who Cares When I'm Rejected, and we realized that was actually too personal, and it was actually kind of weird dynamic inviting people to that Sunday. And we would say if you're doing a series, it works best to start with the least common issue and end with the most common issue. The only other thing that we've done which is really different, which we haven't done as a sermon series but could be done as a sermon series, is in the book Who Cares When I Can't Cope. We just really talked about the whole theme of feeling overwhelmed by life, feeling like you've got too much on your plate to cope with, and how is it that Jesus can help with that. And that book that I wrote was quite different. I wanted to write something quite practical, and I guess you could look at a big theme like that and almost speak through the stages of how is it that Jesus in the gospel helps us when we just feel overwhelmed and we can't cope with the things that are difficult in life. That would be potentially a third approach that you could take to the other two that I've mentioned. But I've got no test case of that happening. But I know that book's been extremely well received. We recommend, I said this before, that you run a series of 4 to 6 Sundays if you're going to do them on hurts. I think you could do a longer series if you took a different approach. But if it's directly on painful life issues, like 10 weeks, the feedback that we've had is that 10 weeks is quite really too long. And therefore, we would potentially encourage you, if you're doing 4 to 6, to kind of spread them out over the responding phase, not necessarily over consecutive weeks. So those would be my kind of tips on choosing your series. Publicizing your preaching series, just a few things. I would say you want to make sure that you publicize it very widely, that you allow plenty of lead-in time for people to invite their friends. Realistically, people need time. I mean, I had someone that I wanted to invite who I'd asked the question to, and it took me 2 weeks to remember to take the flyer to a moment where I was going to see this person. And I'm keen. I mean, I came up with the idea, but it took me 2 weeks to really the cogs to kind of click. So you need to give people time. So getting that publicity done promptly is key. We've seen positive reaction to having a market stall where you have like balloons, banners, the free books and the flyers, and you just bump into people and say, would you like a free book? Did you know about the survey that's happened? And do you want to know what we're doing to respond? We've seen people come to church off the back of that. You can also use print media. I mean, flyers work well. You can post something in every door. If ideally, if you're going to knock on doors to ask the question, you want to knock on doors to give the information. And if someone's not in, then I guess post it. If you don't do door knocking, but you still want to let everyone know about it, we find that actually it's more efficient to pay someone else to do the delivery for you, and you can get it delivered in like a local newspaper for actually not that much money, and that's actually quite a good use of resource. If you haven't knocked on doors the first time and you want to make sure everyone gets the information, that's worth doing. And then I think you can put banners, you can put stuff outside your church about the series. We've got some mock-ups of different adverts as well that could be put out there. And some churches put information in the newspaper. I would say that's quite expensive. You want to it's cheaper to actually do a press release and get a flyer inserted in the paper. Okay, I then just want to talk briefly about preparing your material. The excellent article that Andrew Wilson wrote called The Essential Gospel is a brilliant starting point for your reading and preparation. The key in preparing your preach is that you want to connect the issue raised by the survey to Jesus. We're not experts in psychology, but we do have something to say about Jesus. And we may not have suffered in the particular area that we're preaching on, but we can point to the one who was tempted in every way. Now, as the gospel is good news, it's not good advice. We're not primarily looking for tips or practical wisdom on how to handle suffering, although you might touch on that. But mainly we're trying to proclaim the truth that Jesus has come among us, died in our place, rose again, he will come again, and how that connects with this issue. Realistically, you're only going to be making an introduction. You're not going to be able to cover the subject comprehensively. You're trying to make a link between the issue and Jesus. I think I would say we've got the examples in the book for you to look at, where you can see that how we approached it in our 6 talks. I would say another thing that I would encourage you to do is get other people to help you with your research. So this was an idea I got from Rick Warren. He talked about having a sermon research team, and I've only ever done this with Who Cares, but it worked well. Once we decided on the 6 issues that we were doing, I got a bunch of people to I gave them a brief and said, could you, a week before I'm delivering my sermon, prepare for me a 1-page summary of quotes, stories, links to things that you think would be helpful in the talk that I'm giving on this theme. And I think, to be honest, it just helped having more people own it with me, think about it, pray it over with me. And that was key too. Okay, I'm just going to finish by giving you 10 top tips for making your Sunday special. Okay, number 1, try and get interviews to complement the message of the preach. So we had someone share a testimony before the preach on our Who Cares Sunday as much as we possibly could, and it was always of great benefit. Some people are good at just sharing something that they've written. Some people are better on interview. My second top tip would be consider doing Q&A via text message. Just that element of interaction can be really powerful, where people text a question and it gets put up on the PowerPoint. Thirdly, when sharing on the issues, I would say it's important that the tone is appropriate. And what I mean is that actually it's possible, I think, on these Sundays to be a bit too downcast. While what people have written on their cards is going to be quite raw and real, you can still use humor. And actually, the people coming into your building will have, even if they've written something on, even if there's someone who happened to have written something on their card that was really painful, they're not necessarily living with that like top of their mind, and they're not necessarily, they're used to living with it, and therefore don't feel like you can't use humor. We want to bring hope and light, but without being trite or brash. But one of my observations is that sometimes there can be, I don't know, when you're preparing and you're like looking at all the answers, there can definitely be almost you can feel like you've got to be really, really down and low and low in the way that you talk. But actually, you can be hopeful. It does work. Number 4, I would say make an effort to make your building look great. put balloons up, banners up, wear t-shirts, do things just to make the whole thing feel special. Number 5, I would encourage you to have a wall of responses somewhere. That can be really powerful. We've got a board that we've made really professionally of the different responses. I mean, you can buy it; it's quite expensive to do it, but we've got someone in our church that can make one, and you can buy it from them, or you can make your own. But having a wall of responses is definitely something that we would encourage you to do, because there's something very powerful about those, and you can use those. You can use that board of responses when you're asking the question in a group, but also when you're responding on a Sunday. Top tip number 6: have a book stand with giveaway books. We've really been surprised at the success of giveaway evangelistic literature through Who Cares. We'd really encourage you to have a book stand with your giveaway books on your special Sundays. Tip number 7, and I've kind of mentioned this already, but make sure you give people a next step in the service, a card to fill in where they can say, yeah, I'd like to know more about Christianity, or I'd like to receive prayer, or I'd like to be given a bit more literature. Or a next step in the service is key. Number 8, just don't forget to think like a new person. It's all the basic things, don't say we all know the story of David and Goliath, because realistically, not everyone knows the story of David and Goliath. In your language, you can use Christian terms, Bible terms, but just make sure if they're not obvious what they are, that you explain what they mean. Top tip number 9, just make sure that you're working at encouraging your welcoming culture in your church. Encourage your church to be welcoming, to be friendly. Just giving them a bit of wisdom, a bit of a reminder about that is worth doing. And then my top tip number 10 would be, just don't be too different or weird or unrelaxed. Just because it's a service with a different theme and with a different feel, you don't want everyone in your church to suddenly go really weird or awkward, or like, oh, I don't know what I meant to do. Be your normal selves. And then I guess the last thing I would just say is that I'd encourage you that once you've done your sermons, to think about turning that material into a giveaway booklet for even beyond when your responding phase finishes. Just to have that resource available to people can be really helpful. You will potentially have put a lot of time into that content, so you want to use it. Okay, so that I've gone through it a bit quicker today, my material, because I wanted to really allow time for questions. So we've got 10 minutes before we finish. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. This will get recorded I'm going to keep the recording on.